Hi, Pastor Rohan. It's me again.
Hello,
Jeanie here.
Jeanie. How are you?
I'm good.
Are you tired today?
I am tired today,
Okay.
yes.
That's all right. I recorded the episodes before this when I was very tired, so don't feel too bad.
Okay.
I'm not tired today, so maybe I'll make up for your time.
All right, good. I'm expecting you to lead all of this.
Oh.
You do anyway, but
No, you're very good at
more than
leading
normal.
Okay, more than normal.
Yes. So we're talking about 2 Samuel chapters. This is chapter 16 we're going to
Chapter
talk about.
16. Yep.
Yeah, this is crazy stuff.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, this is Game of Thrones.
It is a little bit like that
Yeah.
because there's all people vying for the throne and for authority and power and exercising control. It's all a theology of power, isn't it?
Yes, total power. And just can you fill me in what has actually happened before this? I know David seemed to have some kind of moral failure.
Yeah, so this is chapter 16, and over the course of this week's episodes, we're going to do 16 to 20. A lot of that, certainly 16, 17, 18, there is to do with this fallout with his son Absalom, which is directly related back to last week's episodes that I did with Annalise, where it started with the story of David and Bathsheba and the famous adultery and murder that he committed there. And the flow-on effect of that was that Nathan the prophet came to him and actually said to him, Dave, God's forgiven you for your sin because you've repented, but there are consequences for your actions. Those consequences will play out in the nation, and they will play out in your family. And that's really what we're going to see all the way through, is that he actually says something like, Nathan says, because you have done this sinful thing and you've forced the others around, the other nations around, the enemies of the Lord, to show contempt, you've not represented me well. I've forgiven you, but I'm going to allow calamity to come out of your own household, and there will be division within your own household.
So God didn't ever say to David, I'm going to take away the kingdom.
No, in fact, quite the opposite. In chapter 7, which I did, which was 2 weeks ago, David was promised a covenant from the Lord that he would always have a descendant on the throne, always, an eternal covenant, which ultimately is called the Davidic covenant, and it ultimately leads to Jesus. And all the rest of the story of the Old Testament, all the way through to the Babylonian exile, is a story of God's faithfulness to David, despite the human frailty and falling short and the sin and so on.
And Absalom is his son?
Yep, Absalom is his firstborn son, I believe.
Okay, so could David, who we know is on the run at this point in the story, could David actually be thinking, Absalom is my descendant that's going to reign from now
on? Could he have been thinking that?
Yeah. If there's a descendant always on the throne.
Yeah, I think it's quite possible he could have, except that in the previous chapters, what's transpired since the sin of David and Bathsheba is David had another son called Amnon, and Amnon, who he actually he assaulted Absalom's full sister, who was Amnon's half sister. So he basically sexually assaulted her.
He didn't basically. I mean,
he essentially did. Yes,
he did in a very
terrible way, which led Absalom to stir up the hatred inside him and want revenge, and he ultimately killed Amnon. And so there was
this Game of Thrones. I swear,
this is it. This is a civil strife within the political court, within the family, which is not that uncommon. Anytime there's power, there's always people trying to corrupt and use that power in the wrong way. And so that led to an estrangement between David and Absalom, which in the couple of chapters before, David had begrudgingly allowed Absalom back into his world, but not all the way back into his world. And Absalom still had his eye on the throne. He wasn't even prepared to wait until he could have the throne. He wanted it sooner. And so he basically stole the hearts of Israel, a lot of the people, and won them to his side. So then he launched a coup. And essentially that's where we're up to in the story. He's launched a coup. His own son has launched a coup against him, and David has decided, I need to get out of Jerusalem before Absalom comes back from Hebron. If he comes back, there's going to be bloodshed in the streets. So David's decision to leave was actually to protect the people. He didn't want a civil war. And he was prepared to leave and trust that God would bring him back if he wanted him back. And if God didn't want him back, then he would trust that, okay, God knows what he's doing. God's faithful. I'm going to trust him anyway. But it shows David's heart to protect the people of Jerusalem from a civil war by running away before Absalom returned.
Really? You think it shows his heart, or do you think maybe he was just guilty and in fear? Because I think he could have stayed.
He could have stayed, but he knew that to stay would have meant that he would have had to fight against Absalom.
And by running away, he thinks he's not going to fight?
I think that's exactly what he's thinking.
So he's effectively giving up his kingdom.
He is effectively trusting God with his kingdom, I think.
Trusting God or saying to God, you know what? I don't care anymore.
Yeah.
Like, if you want me in this position, you bring me back.
And, well, that's a really good point, because this is what I love about 1st and 2nd Samuel. We were just saying off air beforehand. These are some of the best writings for character studies you'll ever find in any piece of literature. Like, you can study this stuff the way you would study Shakespeare and just get into the characters, because it's limited. So you're left to speculate a lot, which is good, because human relationships and we humans are complicated beings. There isn't a black and white. There is never a one size fits all when it comes to relationships. And so with that in mind, we can look at this and go, that's a valid question. What was really David thinking? Was he thinking, I'm just going to trust God and leave, I'm had enough of this? Or was he thinking, I'm actually trying to protect the people? I would tend to think he was trying to protect the people. He is deeply aware, no doubt about it, we'll see it in a couple of chapters' time. He is deeply aware that the strife within his family is caused by his sin and his murder of Uriah and his the whole thing with the adultery with Bathsheba. He knows that is the cause of the problems in the family.
I just want to ask here, you mentioned Amnon, the son who was murdered by Absalom for abusing the sister.
Yep.
Did David ever punish Amnon for what he did?
No.
So David was not. How good of a father was David?
David is a very conflicted human being, and this is why it's important. We look at it and go, hey, how are we conflicted too? David has some incredible strengths, and he has some things where he is like unique in his ability to serve the Lord. But when it came to his family, he was very conflicted. When it came to his extended family, he was very conflicted. So in previous weeks I was talking about with Phil Weirden about Joab. And Joab is David's nephew. And you're going to see Joab up here again.
Yes.
He is another one. David cannot bring himself to deal with his direct family line. He has a different standard by which he will judge his family, and his own complexities of his own emotion get in the way of being rational about that. So he will be unfair, or he will sometimes let his family off the hook in ways he wouldn't let others off the hook. So, for example, in 2 previous accounts, we have right back in chapter 1 and then chapter a few chapters afterwards, we have 2 accounts of David hearing that, testifying that someone has killed, first of all, Saul, and someone has killed Ishbosheth. And in both cases, he sentenced them to capital punishment. Then we get this story where he hears that Amnon has assaulted his stepsister, and we hear that Absalom has killed Amnon, and he does not deal with that. He doesn't go there. And I think a part of it, I'm just putting myself in the story, I think a part of it is the complexity of family relationship. Sometimes you're in a no-win situation. If I side with that child, I'm going to affect that child, and I'm going to blow up the whole thing. And David tends to wash his hands of it and hope it goes away.
Well, what was the law here? What should have David done in regards to Amnon?
If you were following Mosaic law, Absalom should have been killed.
What? Really?
According to Mosaic law, if you're taking it to the letter of the law, he had committed murder, and murder was a capital punishment. But
so David disregards the law.
Yeah, let's step back one step further. So what should have happened to David when he committed murder of Uriah? He was also subject to the same punishment.
That is true. But he was the only one who could make himself die, right?
Yeah. That's right. So there is power.
A way to say
there are power complexities in this story. But I think it also shows that even in the story, in the Old Testament, there was room, because Nathan the prophet was the one who said to David, the Lord's taken away your sin, and you're not going to have to die. He says, you will not die for this sin. So even though Nathan he could have said to him, right, you've committed murder, you're going to die. So there's space within even the Old Testament for variations of the law. We just come off the Deuteronomy series recently. We've looked at that. So that's kind of what's going on here. So whether or not it was capital punishment, let's just park capital punishment for a minute. The best David could do was do banishment. He banished Absalom, wouldn't let him come into the city. And even when he did let him come back, he said, he's not coming to see my face.
Did he banish Absalom, or did Absalom just take him away?
Absalom ran, but David wouldn't let him come back.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. David wouldn't let him. It took Joab to try and convince David to let Absalom back. and it took Absalom to burn down Joab's field to get Joab to take enough attention of him so that he could convince
Oh, wow.
David. The webs we weave through sin are so well described in this that the complexity of human relationship. That's why it's worth doing this slowly and carefully, because there is so many applicable relationship things that we can gain for our own lives in this stuff.
Did King David grieve Amnon's death?
Did he grieve Amnon's death? He grieved. Yes, he did grieve. He did. It says that he grieved Amnon's death for a long time. And then at the end of that grief, it says, I'm just off the top of my head, then at the end of the grief, it says something like, and after some time, after he finished grieving Amnon's death, his heart started to turn to Absalom and he longed to see Absalom again. But his stubbornness wouldn't let him come back.
Okay.
So isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So he's got two sons and he's just the complexity of one's done wrong to the other, but I'm grieving this one, I'm angry with this one, but I still love this one. This is human nature.
Yes, it is human nature. And Absalom is roughly, 25-ish?
I don't know. Have you checked that? I would say so. That would be about right.
And King David's in his mid-50s.
Probably 50s by now. Yes, that's right.
And Solomon is about
He'd be younger.
5 or 6.
Yeah, he'd be a much younger boy, I would imagine, by this stage.
Yeah. This is just fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it really is. And yesterday here in Australia, we had Father's Day, and other countries have that in June. But as I've been reading this, I've been really reflecting on what kind of a father was David.
Yeah.
And we place David on this pinnacle, yet really he stands as an example in many ways of what not to do.
Yeah, that's right. David has moments of brilliance and moments of just completely flawed.
Yeah, well, because we can read that he's a good leader. He's
You got
very
half a
good
goal.
at war. Like he's a skilled
strategist.
Yes.
He's military strong. He does have a heart for his people. He serves the Lord. He longs to be generous to the people. He does all those things.
But do we ever read he's a good dad?
No, he's not. And there are very, very few signs of good parenting anywhere in the Bible. Have you ever stopped thinking about that?
Yeah, I have thought about that. Yeah.
Yes. Usually when it comes to parenting, the Bible is a whole lot of lessons in what not to do.
Yeah, it is. And when you think about the idea that God is meant to be the father, he's giving us so many examples here of what a good father is not.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But I find encouragement in that. I would much rather read that because that reflects real life. I would much rather read that than a whitewashed cookie cutter Superman David story or any of these Bible characters that don't have any frailty. Oh, they're so far on the pedestal. I could never be like them. I love the fact that the Bible just shows it all, warts and all.
Yeah, and that's why I think these books are really important. I know a lot of people just don't want to read the Old Testament, but the more you look into it, the more shades of grey and that you see in it, and the more you can learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful storytelling. It's like you could turn this into a movie.
It's a great story.
Like you say, it's Game of Thrones kind of interpersonal relationship stuff. It's all there.
Yeah.
Power play.
Yeah, everything.
Family drama. It's like Succession meets Game of Thrones all in one kind of thing.
It is. It absolutely is. And it's just, and what I find really interesting in it is David never once inquires of the Lord.
Yes, I think you've mentioned that before to me.
Yeah, because you read that in other chapters where it says David inquires of the Lord, and he does it multiple times, but never.
Refresh our mind on that. You said the last time he did it was when he was in Ziklag after
You've got a good memory.
After Saul had died, he inquired of the Lord, shall I go up to
he did.
The kings just after Saul had died. And then you don't hear about it until much later.
Yes. Yeah, but you don't hear about it at all here.
That's right. So this is David getting solidified, and now he's starting to feel like maybe he's starting to rest on his own laurels a bit. Maybe he's less dependent on God and more dependent on the fact his own skill ability, which is good, but it's not ever going to be sufficient.
He makes a lot of choices here that you think, if you just prayed about that, it might have had a very different outcome. Like, for example, if you'd have just prayed about whether you should leave Jerusalem or not, your fortified city, right?
Yeah.
But he leaves.
He left.
Doesn't inquire of the Lord. He leaves.
Yep.
Maybe he wasn't meant to leave.
Maybe he wasn't meant to leave.
Maybe he should have believed in the promise that he was still God's king. He was elected by God.
Yeah.
Absalom is not.
No. Maybe that would have happened. I mean, it ended up in a civil war anyway, so
yeah,
we're going to see that in the next chapter.
Could have stopped
maybe
a lot of that.
Stopped the civil war. Yeah. But we'll see. I mean, he's still deeply grieved at when spoiler alert, Absalom's going to die in this story, but he's deeply grieved by that because he knows that even this mess with his son he feels responsible because of his own failings. And I liken it to the Bathsheba story, but I think deep down inside, we all as parents who are parents, we're aware of our failings. We're aware of the times when we've not met, lived up to standard. And we see that, maybe we'll see that played out in the next generation and we feel responsible. I think that's what David's doing here.
I think he is full of guilt. His guilt just causes him to sort of give up and leave.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can take that on board. I think he's certainly, he recognizes his forgiveness. So Psalm 51 is the famous psalm of, creating me a clean heart, O God. He recognizes he's forgiven. I would say more, whether it's guilt or just absolute sheer disappointment at his behavior, that now he's living out and his family are living out the consequences of a dumb action.
We're seeing you sow what you reap.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. That's what's going on. It's almost like this despair.
Sorry, you reap what you sow. The other
sow.
way around.
Yeah.
How did I get that so wrong?
Yeah, you reap what you sow. That's right. So I think that's what we're seeing is this level of awareness in David that his actions have had a ripple effect. And that's a rippling effect throughout family and through the nation, ultimately.
Yeah, and I think as well he's been humbled.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And he is maybe at this point ready to just cast it onto God. Maybe that's what he says in the previous chapters. Well, if God wants me back, he'll bring me back.
So maybe this is the beginning of that breaking down of his self-reliance a little. Yeah. So it's interesting. There's all these different speculations and the scriptures don't tell us. They don't define us what's really going on inside the heart. And I've had people say, oh, you can't speculate because of that. Whereas I'd say, hey, don't build doctrine on it. But it's really good to speculate because in reality, none of us know what's going on. I don't know what's going on inside your heart right now. You don't know what's going on inside my heart right now. We're trying to relate while we never really know each other. That's the complexity of human relationship. We can make assumptions about people's hearts. We have to find a way to make the right assumptions and then not make actions on things that are just assumptions. But that's human relationship, Jeanie.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. So Absalom here has led a rebellion.
Yes.
And David is out of the city. And Absalom is now the king.
He's coming in and he's taking the throne, yep.
Okay, so the people around him, Israel, aside from the people that have gone with David, they're all behind Absalom.
Yes.
Except for a few spies.
Except for a few spies, yeah. Whether they're all behind or they just do what they're told. But, because you can be behind out of fear or you can be behind out of allegiance. And I suspect, as is the case in any kind of relationship situation, there'll be some who were pro-David that are just feigning allegiance and there would be others who just genuinely were behind Absalom. So, yeah, you never get everybody's heart. That's leadership. You never win everybody. Yeah.
And he's taken his entire family, but he's left behind 10 concubines.
Yep. Crazy.
He's left the women to run the place.
Yes, maybe so. Essentially, that's what maybe that's what he's thinking. But
it is an interesting choice. Why leave them?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, they play out, don't they?
They do play out in the story.
They have a part in the story.
Yeah, maybe it was to keep the palace. But if he knows Absalom's showing up, I don't know. Maybe it shows a problem with the whole issue of concubines, that he just didn't value them and respect them enough to protect them. I don't know.
Yeah, that's another thing to think about, isn't it? So David here, he is aware that he has merited wrath. I've got this note. And he publicly has confessed because he's gone in bare feet, covered head, and in tears. That's from the previous chapter to this.
When he's walking out of Jerusalem, you mean, through the streets?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
And so David has launched a plan. He has kept some people behind, even though they wanted to go with him, to inform him of what Absalom is doing. So he's clever.
Yes, he's in the middle of this. He's still doing a little bit of political scheming.
Yes, yeah. He's walking out crying in bare feet, but he's like, "Hey, you stay.
You guys, you two stay behind there, and you stay in the court, and you can report to these two dudes, and these two dudes will tell me what's happening." Yeah, that's right.
So the chapter actually starts off with this strange encounter with, and I'm never going to say it right. No, Mephibosheth.
Mephibosheth. Say it 3 times. That's what Phil told me to do.
Mephibosheth.
Oh. It's hard, isn't it?
Thanks.
I've been practicing it over the last 48 hours since I'm
just going to call him Meph.
Meph. Okay, we'll call him Meph.
To Meth.
Yeah, well, that's what we were saying. Maybe just call him Meth.
Meth. Okay. And David passed the
His name actually means something to do with shame, which is his story. And
he is a crippled grandson of Saul.
Yes, Jonathan's son. Saul's grandson, crippled.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And Jonathan was David's best friend.
yeah, that's
and
right.
great
No,
leader
we
and
revisit
warrior.
Jonathan in the story, but that's who Mephibosheth is. We did a whole chapter on that. It's worth back going and listening to 2 Samuel 9, puts it in perspective. It's a brilliant story, but that's who this Mephibosheth is. He should have ordinarily would have been killed. Let's put it in context for our listeners that haven't listened to previous ones. David came to power. Ordinarily, what a king would do would be to immediately kill all potential threats to the throne.
And that's expected.
That was expected and normal throughout European history, even up to the last few hundred years as well. So that would be what you would expect to happen. But instead of that, David, representing a Christ-like attitude, in one of his arguably his highest moment of all, actually elevates Mephibosheth, finds him, looks for him, wants to honor Jonathan, his father, and sits him down at his table, gives him a place among one of the king's sons, basically treats him like a prince, even though he was a potential threat to the throne. That's this Mephibosheth.
So David has been very kind to him and generous, and he's at his dinner table, so he has conversations with Mephibosheth. He's sort of part of the family.
He is. It says he ate at the table like one of the king's sons. So that strikes that he's been treated like a prince.
Okay, so David would have expected Mephibosheth to go with him.
Yes.
To leave the city because his family's gone. Mephibosheth, jeez Louise, Meph should have gone with him.
Yeah.
Okay, but instead his steward or his assistant, I guess, Ziba, his name is, he meets him with a string of pack animals. They're all saddled and loaded with 100 loaves of bread and some raisins and some fruit and some wine.
Yep.
And the king says to Ziba, "What is all this?" And Ziba replied, I'm reading from the message.
The message, yep.
Yeah. The donkeys, said Ziba, are for the king's household to ride. The bread and fruit are for the servants to eat. And the wine is for drinking, especially for those overcome by fatigue in the wilderness. So he's come with this huge pack of blessing. But the king doesn't even say anything about it. David's like, but where's Mephibosheth?
Where's Meph gone? Yeah.
And Ziba says he stayed in Jerusalem. But not only that, he says that Mephibosheth said, "This is the day Israel is going to restore my grandfather's kingdom to me."
Interesting.
So David is hearing treachery, I suppose, a betrayal.
Yep.
And he would have grown close to this guy, and this would have been heartbreaking.
Absolutely heartbreaking. You know how you feel when you absolutely give 110% to somebody and then they throw it back in your face? You feel like you're completely disrespected. I can handle doing something nice for someone and not getting thanks. I'm actually not too bad with that. This is my own confession time now. But I really struggle when I do something nice for someone and not only do they not say thanks, but then they accuse me of not doing enough.
Yes, yeah.
Something rises. It's my sinful nature. Right? Something rises in my self-defense in that moment. And I totally identify with what David would have been feeling here.
But add to that, if somebody then said to you, "You know what, Pastor Rohan, I've been helping you, serving you, everything like that, but I've actually been waiting for this other person to come in." Yeah, they would be completely two-faced.
Totally. I can totally feel what David's feeling. In the middle of his grief and loss and uncertainty, this is like a nail in the coffin. This is like another bit of bad news.
Yeah, so he doesn't act irrationally here, I think, when he says to Ziba, "Well, everything that belonged to Mephibosheth, it's yours now."
Yep. Not that he's got a whole lot of power at this moment.
But he's a bit angry.
He's angry, but yes, that's what you're feeling. Yep, you can have it all.
Yeah.
Right.
But interesting, David assumes that he's still going to own it all.
Yes.
That he is still going to be the king.
Yeah, that's what it seems to say.
Yeah.
But he's leaving. Maybe he has got this assumption he's coming back in time. But because technically, if he's left and he's in exile, he probably doesn't have the authority to tell Ziba he can have it. But
he has his spies there.
Yep.
So he has some hope or
he's got some hope of being able
to come back.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I think that's what he's definitely longing for, the chance to come back. And it's very clear he wants to come back with peace and without bloodshed, especially the bloodshed of his son. He hoped that maybe his son would turn around or see the error of his ways, or worst case scenario, be captured and, disciplined. But that was probably his best case scenario, and that's not what happened.
No, that is not what happens. So Ziba is very grateful. "How can I ever thank you? I'll be forever in your debt, my master and my king. May you always look on me with such kindness."
Oh, that sounds like nice words from Ziba, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And then David has this strange moment where a man appears who also had connections with Saul's family, and his name was Shimei. Shimei,
Yep.
Son of Gera. And he follows along and he's shouting insults at David. and throwing rocks right and left at David and his company, servants and soldiers and alike. Loudly, so yelling, throwing
Get
rocks.
out, you scoundrel.
Yeah, but not hitting them. Just says left and right.
Yeah, it
Hit him,
it would have done. I think the picture I've always seen is him on the side of the hill, handfuls of rocks and gravel, and just tossing them at David down as David walks past, you know?
Yeah, and he's like...
Something out of a Monty Python skit.
Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, I can just see this guy on the side of the road. Get lost, you butcher, you hellhound. God has paid you back for all your dirty work in the family of Saul and for stealing his kingdom. So this guy, Shimei, is very much still behind Saul.
Yes, and he's a Benjamin.
Yeah, he's not angry about David and Bathsheba and Uriah. He's angry because he thinks Saul should still be the king.
That's right. Yep.
So even in David's kingdom, there were people that weren't so happy that he was the king.
Correct. And so go back to previous week's conversations around the whole tussle following Saul's death. There's a 7-year period of unrest. There's 2 years where one of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth, sits on the throne. Then he's ultimately killed. And there's another 5 years of unrest. But in this time, there's all this allegiance to Saul's family and this confusion among the people as to whether we want David to be our king or whether we want Saul to be our king. And this is many, many years later. So, you know, we're talking a long time down the track now, probably potentially 20 years plus down the track by this point, aren't we? When's this happening? Yeah, it would be sometime later, because Absalom's grown up now. So after all of this, there is this still this division among the people. They're not totally unified.
He even says here, God has given the kingdom to your son Absalom. Look at you now, ruined, and good riddance, you pathetic old man. He wasn't that old.
He wasn't that old, 50 or something, yeah.
And Abishai, the son of Zeruiah. Now, who is Abishai?
Abishai is one of David's nephews. There were 3 brothers, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Asahel was killed in a previous few chapters by one of Saul's men, Abner, who was killed by Joab. But Abishai and Joab outlived their brother, and they are the commander of the army. Joab's the commander of the army, and Abishai is one of the senior generals in the army. Let's just say that. It
seems like they don't mind a little bit of blood and gore.
These guys are bloodthirsty, pragmatists. What's the word I'm after? They're pragmatists. They regularly go against David's will. They're in it for their own gain. They misuse their power, especially Joab. Pretty messed up, dude. But Abishai's the same.
And he says, this mangy dog can't insult my master, the king, this way. Let me go over and cut off his head. Even though they're all those things that you said, are they loyal to David?
Yes, they're loyal to David, no doubt about it, but they're loyal to David on their terms. They regularly go against David. And David, just like he doesn't have the guts to do stuff with his own family, he doesn't have the guts to do with these nephews in the way he should. And I can understand why. Their mum is his sister. So once again, you've got family drama. If I discipline them, it's going to cause a family rift, all kinds of things that would be normal there. These are complex family relationships. But these 2 dudes, while loyal to David, are always thinking they know better than David about how to do things.
I'm so glad you said that, because that adds to the whole Game of Thrones things. These are family people. Yep. And they are also very influential with the military.
Oh, incredibly.
With the army.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If they wanted, they could take the military away and launch a coup.
So David needs them as much as they need David.
Yep, that's right. Exactly. And this statement here, who asked your opinion, you sons of Zeruiah? You often see a phrase like that, or what am I going to do with you, sons of Zeruiah? It was a phrase he used all the time, which kind of shows the powerlessness he felt about these 2 men.
Yeah, he says, look at you, you sons of Zeruiah, always wanting to kill people or something like that.
He's constantly, what am I going to do with you kind of feel like. He just feels like, I actually said in a previous episode, Joab, certainly, and Abishai as well, they're like David's kryptonite. They just bring out a weakness in his character. But I understand why, because of the complexity of the relationships.
And so they're cousins to Absalom.
They're cousins to Absalom, correct, yes. They're Absalom's cousins, that's right.
Yeah, it's good to know all that, because you can, if you just gloss over these names, because it's so easy to do, because they're such weird names and you just think, who's this person?
Yes.
But you need to know cousins, nephews, sons.
Yep. It's
All,
all blended together into this complex web of interpersonal relationships being played out in a political court.
yeah, all fighting for their monarchy, their version of the monarchy in some way.
Yeah. So you think about this. This is the way most kingdoms have worked throughout history. But at least now we've largely woken up to the dangers of nepotism.
Yeah, right.
You know, and this is
Yes.
why, because basic rules and ways to engage in relationships tend to go out the window when there's family relationships involved, because it's harder to be much more objective when there are such subjectivity in the way those interpersonal relationships will fall out
Yes.
among other family
Yeah.
members. Yeah.
Oh, that's what I wanted to ask you. What other ancient texts have discussions about the moral failures of their leaders?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say not too many.
Why would they include this in these scriptures? Why are we learning about these bad things about David? Shouldn't we just learn that he's the conqueror? Why are we learning about his sinful life?
For me, that gives me the integrity of the Bible. Let me rephrase that. For me, that encourages me that the Bible is accurate and integrous, because that's not the way most ancient writings were written. They were always written from the victor's perspective, and they downplayed their weaknesses and elevated their strengths. So this is the Old Testament showing what Jesus is. It's an upside-down kingdom. I'll boast in my weaknesses, Paul says, because in my weakness he's strong. I love this about it. It makes it real to me that these are characters who show their warts and all.
Yeah, and what's that verse? All scripture is God breathed and
2 Timothy 3:16.
yeah, can you finish it out for me?
All scripture is God breathed and is useful for training in doctrine, correcting. I don't remember how that you put the four things, but basically it's for training in right believing and wrong believing, and training in right believing, correcting wrong believing, training in right behavior, correcting wrong behavior. That's the four things.
Yeah.
How to live right and believe right.
Yeah, okay, because the more that we do these podcasts and the more I study it, the more my old thinking that the Bible was just something you should read and agree with and think and not question, the more I do this, the more I realize all of those things that we're actually meant to sit and think about it and study, and it is an example more of what not to do.
What not to do. Yep. Every now and then you get that glimmers of hope. Oh, I could be like that. And then the next minute they stuff it up. But that's our story.
Human nature.
Human nature. We're not all bad. There are moments in us humans are capable of incredibly wonderful things, and then incredibly evil things in the same moment. The same human.
Yeah, yeah. And it makes me think as well, like, how much does God love people?
Yeah.
Because he's allowed, he perseveres, and this story is allowed to be told over and over again. God could have, because David is described as a king or man after God's own heart, God could have gotten rid of all of this, but yet here we are reading about all his warts and all.
Yep. And whether it's Moses, Abraham, David, Paul himself, these flawed characters. Jacob, they're all there's very few.
Yep.
In fact, I think in the Old Testament, in terms of men at least, Joseph and Daniel are probably the only two that you don't see their flaws.
Yeah, that's right.
And you see Joseph's naivety, but no moral failing in him and no moral failing in Daniel.
Yeah.
They're the only two characters.
Yeah, and so this is just such an example of how much God does love people, because God's promise is never taken from David.
That's right.
Even though he goes through all of these horrible things, the purpose and plans for David remain intact. No matter what David does, God is still going to restore the plan.
Yep, be faithful to God's original intention and promise. Yep.
And right now it wouldn't feel like that to David.
No,
he
feels
feel
like
it's
lost
all
everything.
over. Yeah, like God, like as he said, if God wants me back, he'll bring me back. I don't think that sounded very faithful. That sounded like I'm just giving up.
It's more fatalistic, isn't it?
Yeah. And so in the next few chapters, we're going to see God just starts to restore him, aren't we?
Yep.
Okay, where were we? See, I get distracted because this stuff is so good.
Yep.
So David actually, we're talking about that guy who was Shimei throwing the rocks at him. But David says, why are you sons of Zeruiah always interfering and getting in the way? If he's cursing, it's because God told him to curse David. Sorry, I didn't read that very well. It's because God told him to curse David. So who dares raise questions? There's a little bit of self-flagellation going on here. Yeah.
I think the NIV says something like maybe God told him to curse, not just that he's definitely cursing, but it could be that God has told him to curse, and then who am I to argue with God? Yeah.
Besides, David continues to Abishai, my own son, my flesh and bone, is right now trying to kill me. Compared to this, that Benjaminite is small potatoes.
Small potatoes.
It should say small
More fry. Yeah.
Don't bother him. Let him curse. He's preaching God's word to me. And who knows, maybe God will see the trouble I'm in today and exchange the curses from something good. Still not an inquiry of God, is it?
No, it's still fatalistic. It's like I'm leaving this in God's hands.
Yeah, it is very fatalistic.
Yeah.
And we can do that, can't we, in our relationship with God? We just go, well, let him do what he's going to do.
That's right.
So David and his men, they go down the road and this Shimei follows and he keeps it up. The whole time, throwing stones.
On the nearby hillside.
Kicking up dirt, yes. By the time they reached the Jordan River, David and all the men of the company were exhausted.
Just having the guy throw rocks and yell at you would be exhausting enough, let alone the fact that all this has happened.
Yeah, so they're on the what side of the Jordan?
They're on the west side of the
Jordan River. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so you straight out of Jerusalem, across the Mount of Olives, or across the Kidron Valley, up the Mount of Olives, and then straight out to the
So
Red
how
Sea.
far is that?
Oh, I'm going to say 10 kilometres.
Okay, I was going to
It's a
say
decent
30.
walk.
But no.
Yeah, it might be more than 10. It wouldn't be 30, I don't think. Maybe between 10 and 20 off the top of my head.
So by this time, Absalom and all his men were in Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them.
Ahithophel.
What? Oh, there's an H there.
There's an H there.
Ahithophel was with them. Now, he was David's trusted advisor.
Yes.
Correct?
Yep.
And he's described as almost being able to speak the word of God.
Yes.
Okay, so his advice
trusted.
is trusted advice, but he has done the dirty on David. He's betrayed David. He's stayed with Absalom. He stayed with the power, I suppose.
Yeah, it seems like he was all the while. He just chose the wrong side, even though maybe he was manipulatively scheming. I don't know. It doesn't tell us why he did it.
No, it doesn't.
It just says he switched sides. He'd been loyal. It says, what does it say? David considered every word he said as if it had come from an angel of God, something like that. Yeah, so he was deeply respected and trusted. So that adds to this sense of betrayal that David's feeling.
Yeah, and it is a real betrayal because he does want David dead.
Yes.
But he wants to keep his position.
Yep.
He wasn't willing to go with David out into the wilderness.
Nope.
He stays and he bunkers down with Absalom. And soon after that, Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, came and greeted Absalom. Hang on a minute. Is this another betrayal? Because he says, live long the king. Live
live
Absalom.
the king. Yeah, so in the previous chapter, Hushai had come out and wanted to go with David, and this is one of those ones you were referring to. And Dave said, look, you're a bit of an old man. I love you, but you're going to slow me down. You could be a lot more beneficial to me if you went back and pretended to be Absalom's
oh, wow. This is even more Game of Thrones.
Pretend to be loyal to Absalom, and then you can frustrate Ahithophel's advice, is what he says to him.
Okay, so he's there, could be afraid because if he's found out, he could be killed by Absalom. Yep. So he's brave.
He's brave.
He's courageous, yes, and he cares for David.
Yep.
So his heart is with David, but he acts like he's
loyal to Absalom.
Yeah, and it seems like he was a powerful guy.
He had influence.
Absalom really likes him.
Yeah, he had influence. The way the narrative is going to be set up here is that it seems like Ahithophel's advice was probably number one, and Hushai's would normally be number two, okay. But God uses his wisdom to reverse those two.
Okay, now here's an interesting point because Absalom says to Hushai, is this the way you show devotion to your good friend? Why didn't you go with your friend David? So he's surprised to see Hushai, but he doesn't seem surprised to see Ahithophel.
I suspect Ahithophel was involved in the coup because it tells us that Absalom had been slowly gathering, just like you see in the back room of a political party, gathering votes behind the scene. He had been slowly gathering, and he probably had Ahithophel, but he did not have Hushai on side. Did
David annoy Ahithophel at some point?
There's no reference to anything.
No reference. There wasn't any child killed or anything.
I don't think he
Ahithophel wasn't close to Amnon.
No, I don't think we see him in the story until this point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't think he appears anywhere before this.
Right.
No.
Okay. Well, here he is, this well-trusted
advisor, yeah.
Yeah, and Absalom says to Ahithophel, are you ready to give counsel? So he's seeking his opinion. And Ahithophel tells Absalom this very infamous thing. I think.
Infamous. Go ahead.
Infamous to do. So go and sleep with your father's concubines, the ones he left to tend to the palace. Everyone will hear that you have openly disgraced your father, and the morale of everyone on your side will be strengthened. I don't know why he thinks the morale of everybody on Absalom's side will be strengthened by immorality, but because concubines were effectively wives, right?
Yes, but yes, exactly. They're essentially royal property.
Royal property, but so this is immorality.
We've got to separate the two out. It's deeply immoral.
Yes.
However, because wives or concubines were treated different at a different rank to wives, it would be less likely to be seen as adulterous in the eyes of the people. It would be seen as taking something that belonged to your father and claiming it for yourself. So, and I hate even saying that because it's the opposite of what we want to do, which is devalue these women. But that was what it was. The concubines were treated as property. So for Absalom to go and sleep with them was absolute defiance. That was completely in defiance. He was basically stating a claim, these concubines and therefore this kingdom belong to me now. That was the purpose of it.
It's a very different culture to ours,
isn't it? That women would be used in that way is so antithetical to the ways of Christ. But we've got to just remember this is the culture. Doesn't make it right, but we can't then sit back in judgment and dismiss everything because this is just the way people were at the time.
And the next part here, verse 23, the counsel that Ahithophel gave in those days was treated as if God himself had spoken. And that was the reputation of him. So how could Absalom have ever said no?
That's right.
Could he?
Yeah, he would have been. Well, he does eventually say when in the next chapter when Hushai gives the advice.
But no one tells him not to hear.
No one tells him not to.
Hushai doesn't tell him not to.
No, Hushai doesn't tell him not to at this point.
Yeah.
Which, well, you can work out what that means for Hushai. I think Hushai's trying to, save it for the big game, if you like, not overplay his hand too early, because I think that would be just dumb advice to try and counteract that, because that would be regarded as normal, common practice. That if king came to power, one of the first things they would do is they would take those concubines that belonged to the previous king for themselves.
And tell me about concubines. Were they allowed by God, or why? I just find the whole idea so strange and disturbing.
Strange, yeah. I don't know the history of it. It's been something that has been throughout, well, back in the book of Judges, it was a practice. So we're talking about, something that's been around for 3,500 years. I think it probably, in the biblical narrative, you have to trace it all the way back to Lamech in the book of Genesis, who accumulates women, like for himself as a power play, which is ultimately leads to the flood, because it's the spiral down of human sin. So I think whenever women or children or vulnerable people are exploited for the so-called benefit of others, that's where it comes from. And I think it ultimately would boil down to kings having concubines as a way of being able to have their sexual pleasure. In most kings' situations, most of the marriages, the royal marriages, weren't always related to romance. They were political. They were for a political purpose. And so the king could have whatever he wanted and include as many women as he wanted. And probably he had concubines that he specifically maybe appreciated or loved more than the wife, but he couldn't marry her because they weren't from royal lineage and all that kind of complexity stuff.
And there's no point of God being against this at this. What I mean is the people felt that this was okay.
Yeah,
socially okay, and God didn't have an issue with concubines.
Yeah, I think that they would think there might be outcries against it at times, but I think generally speaking, this was just such a normal part of human practice that people just went, it's just the way it is. And it was up until several hundred years ago as well. So many tribes in Africa and so on, they would have, the chieftain would have multiple women. You go into Europe, the kings have multiple women. I said this on the previous episode, one of the hardest places in Europe, one of the worst things to be, most challenging things to be, was a daughter of a European king, because they would usually get shipped off to marry some old dude on the other side of Europe for a political alliance. So this is just normal.
And David had
life.
A couple of those wives as well, didn't he?
Yes, he had some wives prior to becoming king, and then he married others who were kings. So
how many wives did he have? Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's all right. He had he had
The one that starts with M, the first one. Wasn't
yeah,
it Saul's daughter?
Michal, Saul's daughter.
Yeah.
He lost her for a while, then he got her back. Then he had, I'm just trying to think of the one.
The rich man's wife.
Yeah, Nabal's wife. What's
Nabal's
her name?
wife. I don't know. And then
My brain's not
Bathsheba.
working. And Bathsheba came along later on.
Bathsheba. I always get that. I always say Bathsheba.
When
Yeah.
David came back to Jerusalem, he had 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and the wife of Nabal. I can't think of a name now. I can't believe it. So he had 2 wives.
Bethany? But
No, it's not right. It'll come to me. He had 2 wives, plus he previously had Michal. So he comes back, he's got 3. But then it says after he gets into Jerusalem, it talks about him being established. He had more wives, and some of those are political alliances. So he's probably got multiple wives, and he's got a lot of sons, which is just, once again, crazy to us, but just normal practice for a king of a nation.
And a concubine, was she respected around town?
Normally, I don't know.
Like, would a parent want their daughter to be a concubine in the sense that they're looked after?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of that. Yeah, maybe a little bit. I don't know about the respect thing. Oftentimes, in a king's palace, the concubines had a whole different arm of the palace, which was just for them, and they'd all live together. And every now and then, the king would call for one of them. This whole Esther's essentially that story, but in that story, the king calls women one by one and sleeps with them, and if he likes, he wants to marry her. If not, she just becomes a concubine. That's it, and then you may never see the king again. But I think it was incumbent on the king in best practice, if you can use that word best practice in this situation, it would be that they had to supply and provide for the concubine. So I would not be surprised if some parents, if you took it from an economic perspective, might actually think, look, this is not a bad thing, because at least my daughter will be cared for and will be safe and will be not living on the streets and not living in poverty. Once again, complex.
Yeah, very complex. And if they had children, they were not...
They were bastard children. They weren't going to be heirs to the throne, no.
They were considered bastards, or they were just considered David's child but not recognised formally?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it's... I don't know. It depends on whether or not they're regarded as an illegitimate, because they're not technically married to their concubine. So I'm not sure. I'd have to do more research on what level of value was given to the concubine relationship. Was it above just anybody out on the street?
And I'm sure that changes over the centuries as well.
Yes,
anyway,
yeah. We can't narrow it down into one thing.
Yeah,
these are complex times that we're dealing with here, with a worldview that is radically different to ours. And so we need to do it justice to not sit in judgment on it, but try to put ourselves in the story and just assume that just like everybody else, we'd just go along with this. We'd go, that's just the way the world is.
Yeah. Well, let's head to the next chapter.
Okay. That was a long intro to one chapter.
It was.
45 minutes. All right, we're going to go to chapter, what are we doing?
17.
17 for tomorrow's episode. We'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Bible. Wait, what? Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And you can also find us on all the socials. Just search The Bible. Wait, what? And to find out more about our church, just search C3 Camden, C3 Picton, or C3 Thirroul on the web or on the socials. Thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to talking to you on the next episode of The Bible. Wait, what?